Thank you, Hannah, and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope you are doing well and staying safe. Let's dive right in. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam wa rasulullah. Today, we want to discuss a war, a conflict that has not gotten as much attention in recent years as it once did. And that is the war in Yemen, which has caused untold humanitarian suffering to people there and in the region. To discuss what is going on in Yemen, what's the latest, what's the political situation there, what's the state of the war, and what is the role the United States is playing. We want to bring on our special guest, Isaac Evans-Frantz. He is the executive director of Action Corps, which is focused on addressing issues in Yemen. We are very happy to welcome you here today. Hello, Isaac. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me, Edward.
No, thank you for joining us. So first, Isaac, tell us a bit about Action Corps and the work that you do in general and also in regard to Yemen.
Action Corps is a humanitarian advocacy organization that grew out of the International Relief and Development Organization, Oxfam America. We have trained advocates in 25 states and counting. And we are focused on ending U.S. participation in unconstitutional participation in the war in Yemen. 8 years ago, this month of March, the United States backed Saudi-led coalition in their bombing and blockade campaign of Yemen, targeting the Houthis rebels. At this point, the United States continues to be involved with the Saudi-led coalition, providing fuel for the fighter jets, and spare parts and servicing the fighter jets with that logistical military support. And so at Action Corps, what we've been doing is helping build a national coalition. And there are over 100 organizations, national organizations, that have signed on to letters as recently as December. Peace organizations, humanitarian organizations, women's advocacy organizations, organizations that are calling for an end to U.S. involvement. And I can say a little bit more about the status of the war, and if you like. But.
Yes, absolutely. What's the status right now? My understanding is that the Biden administration was able to secure supposedly some sort of pause in the fighting. But what's the current status right now on the ground in Yemen? Who's got control of what? What's the flow of humanitarian aid, and what's the political situation right now?
So the Houthis, who the rebel group that took over the country several years ago or launched a coup, they now control about 80% of the population of Yemen, and the Saudi-backed government controls the rest. I will say that there has been a ceasefire truce that began April 1st of last year. I think the United States government may take a little bit more credit than where credit is due, but there has been a fragile ceasefire truce that expired in October, and fortunately, there have been no further airstrikes on Yemen since then. That is a really important step forward. But our concern is that at any point those airstrikes could resume, that it continues to be a leveraging point that the Saudi-led coalition uses in the war, and there continues to be major restrictions on imports into the country, what's been described as a de facto blockade. And our concern at Action Corps is that the United States is very much complicit in the ongoing suffering. And while the airstrikes have stopped, we still see that there's an economic crisis, that people aren't getting the salaries that they need, that people aren't getting the goods coming into the country, in part because the Saudi-backed blockade of the country. And so we are calling for a Yemen War Powers resolution, a resolution that would challenge the U.S. complicity and challenge the fact that the United States is providing that maintenance support to the Saudi fighter jets that could resume bombing at any time.
So tell me, what's the Biden administration's response to this to the demands for some sort of easing of the blockade and assistance in relieving the humanitarian situation? What's the Biden administration saying about all this?
So first of all, the Biden administration did pledge $444 million worth of humanitarian assistance for Yemen in 2023. They pledged that on Monday. This is part of a $1.2 billion that was pledged by donor countries at a conference on Monday. That's just a fraction. It's less than a third of the $4.3 billion in humanitarian assistance that the United Nations has called on. So this is really a drop in the bucket. It's an important start. In terms of that humanitarian assistance, I think it's important for us to remember that this is not charity. The United States has played a key role in enabling the violence in Yemen, has essentially been a party to the war without authorization from Congress, in violation of the Constitution, violation of Yemen war powers resolutions. And this is the thing, is that the need is much greater, and the United States, we believe, has a responsibility, a moral responsibility and obligation, given the harm that the United States has caused, to provide additional humanitarian assistance. The Biden administration opposes the blockade and the restriction on imports, but the United States government has not used its leverage to stop that. If the United States were to actually stop providing the logistical support for the Saudi fighter craft, that would make it basically impossible for Saudi Arabia to continue persecuting this war. That would be a major challenge for them to continue without those spare parts. That for the U.S.-made fighter jets, they need the U.S.-made spares parts by U.S.-trained personnel who know how to fix the Saudi fighter jets. The United States is essentially playing an enabling role in the ongoing crisis, and the United States could be withdrawing that support, which would basically make it nearly impossible for Saudi Arabia to continue their hostilities in Yemen.
What do you expect in the future in Yemen? Because if the Houthis control a large amount of land, the Saudis control another part of land, are there negotiations to reach some sort of political settlement? What are the potential outcomes here in the long term to resolve the underlying issues so that the humanitarian issue is ideally resolved as well?
Absolutely. So one of the sticking point is around restrictions on imports, or the blockade, if you will, and that has been this. The Houthis have maintained that they're unwilling to negotiate until that's lifted, and see that as a imperative. And there are multiple humanitarian organizations and that have said this, and members of Congress have written to the administration saying that the blockade cannot be used as a bargaining chip, that's actually a violation of international law. It's been described as torture because of its impact on civilians. That should not be used as a leverage in order to gain territorial concessions or other concessions from the Houthis.
So then, do you have any expectation that Congress might do this? The Senate might pass this resolution. What are you hearing from members of Congress?
In December, there was actually, this resolution was about to go to the floor of the United States Senate. There was wide bipartisan support. Well over 100 members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, bipartisan, had co-sponsored this, had endorsed this. And we were expecting a vote in December. Senator Sanders went to the floor where a vote was scheduled, and he announced that he was withdrawing the vote because the Biden administration had been lobbying against it and apparently had succeeded in really eroding the support that he had built for this bill. So what he did commit to was to work with the Biden administration to develop an agreement and negotiate that was be acceptable and ultimately achieve the goals that he was looking for with the Yemen War Powers Resolution. And he committed that if he did not get that, he would come back to the Senate floor with a new Yemen War Powers Resolution. In the absence of any sort of announcement of an end to U.S. Servicing of the Saudi fighter jets or complicity in the war, we are looking for Senator Sanders to introduce this Yemen War Powers Resolution again. And we are calling on him and his colleagues to do that this month, to not let another year of this U.S. enabling of this conflict to unfold.
Finally, Isaac, can you give us an idea of what exactly the people of Yemen have suffered over the past 5 to 10 years? We hear all the time about Ukraine and what the Ukrainians are suffering, but I think we really don't hear, especially these days, a lot about what the people of Yemen have gone through, both from the bombardment by external countries, but also even from the Houthi rebels. That people have been caught in this war and have suffered,
Yes.
extreme difficulty. Can you tell us about the numbers of deaths from war, from disease? Just give us an overview of what people have suffered in Yemen during this conflict.
Sure. Well, according to the United Nations, and this was reported this week, more than 21 million people in Yemen, or 2/3 of the country's population, need humanitarian assistance protection. 2/3 of the country's population. Can you imagine that? 2/3 of the country's population is in need of humanitarian assistance. And the global community has not been able to so far, or has been able to, but has not materialized the support even needed to meet that need. Yemen is home of the largest cholera outbreak in history. Cholera is a preventable disease, waterborne disease, and without clean water, many of the water treatment facility plants were bombed with U.S.-made bombs and U.S. complicity and support by Saudi Arabia. Without that clean water, the cholera has been able to spread. There are multiple other public health crises that are happening in Yemen. And what struck me and got me most involved, originally working on stopping U.S. participation in the war in Yemen, was the hunger crisis, the fact that so many people were being essentially starved to death. So that gives you a little sense of the dynamics of it. But, it's each of those people, when we talk about 21 people, each of those people has a story. And it's sometimes those big numbers can feel a little bit meaningless, but I think about the decisions that sometimes I've heard about parents having to make, like which child that they're going to make sure survives. Imagine that, having to choose between which of your children would get to live, because you don't have resources for all of them.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I mean, it's terrifying, Isaac. And as you said, I mean, words almost can't justice to the numbers. I mean, at some point, the mind becomes numb. You hear 1,000, you can almost comprehend that. You hear 10,000, it's a little hard. And then you hear 1 million, 21 million. How do you even compute or understand the depth of that humanitarian tragedy? But it is something that's horrific. And we appreciate the work that Action Corps is doing, and hopefully, God willing, this will truly come to an end, and the issue will be resolved, and the people of Yemen will be able to live in peace and freedom and justice one day, God willing. And maybe that'll have to start in the U.S. Senate. We shall see. Isaac, I want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you will come back to share some positive updates about what's happening there on the ground in Yemen. And again, thank you so much for your work and for being with us today.
Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you. And Hina, we will send it back to you.